The highway cut through northern Oregon like a narrow ribbon of pale asphalt swallowed by forest. Night pressed close on both sides, turning the tall pines into a wall of shifting silhouettes. Eliza kept her hands steady on the wheel, her old Forester vibrating in the usual uneven rhythm she knew by heart. Every rattle was familiar, every mechanical complaint predictable. She trusted the car the way some people trusted instinct, not because it never failed, but because it usually warned her when it was about to. The sky above the mountains held no stars. A thin layer of cloud dimmed the moon, leaving only the faintest silver haze that blended into the treetops. Eliza had been driving since afternoon, returning from a remote assignment where she'd spent 2 weeks observing migration behavior in semi-isolated coyote populations. The work was methodical, demanding patience and silence. It suited her. Scientific precision had become her refuge after a year marked by loss she didn't speak about anymore. Data was controllable, people were not. The Forester gave a sudden tremor under her feet, a subtle shift in the car's breathing pattern. Before she could respond, the engine lurched once and died. The dashboard lights dimmed in a slow, defeated exhale. Momentum carried the car a little farther until it coasted to a stop near an old turnout, leading to what maps labeled simply as an inactive wildlife preserve. She tried the ignition again. The starter clicked weakly, struggled, failed. No sound followed except the distant hush of wind through trees. She sat still, watching her own breath fog the windshield, then dissolve into the cold air that pressed against the glass. The road was empty. The nearest town lay miles ahead, a place she remembered only vaguely from passing through in earlier field seasons. She stepped out onto the asphalt, pulling her jacket closer. The cold bit quickly, sharp and metallic. Snow lingered in patches along the ditch, glazed into shallow crusts that glimmered faintly under the moonlight. She popped the hood, checked the basics, found nothing obvious. The night felt dense around her, as if listening. When she closed the hood and turned toward the tree line, she noticed a shape she hadn't seen before. A large coyote stood at the edge of the turnout, half shadowed, half visible. Its fur held a reddish tint, darker than the local subspecies should have, and its posture seemed wrong for a wild animal. It neither approached nor retreated. It watched her with a stillness so complete it felt unnatural. The air around it seemed too quiet, too expectant. Before she could process the moment fully, the creature slipped backward into the trees. It did not run. It simply disappeared, leaving no tracks on the thin crust of snow. She stood motionless, pulse quickening in a way that bypassed rational thought. Then headlights appeared on the road behind her, brightening the asphalt before sweeping over her stalled vehicle. A dark SUV slowed beside her car, stopping with controlled precision. The driver's movements, when he stepped out, carried the kind of composure that came from long familiarity with remote places and unpredictable conditions. He offered assistance without pressing, maintaining an awareness of the darkening forest around them. His name was Rowan. He mentioned it without emphasis, as though it were something she could use later if necessary, but not something he was eager to explain. He examined the Forester briefly, then suggested towing it to Hale Bridge, the nearest town. His tone made it clear he did not consider the road safe for waiting alone at night, though he expressed it without alarm or theatrics. She sensed a quiet urgency beneath the surface, as if the forest held rules she did not yet understand. Hale Bridge appeared after several miles of winding descent, a small settlement tucked between the river and the base of the mountains. Wooden storefronts lined the main road, their signs worn by wind and years. Porch lights glowed faintly in the mist, guiding the way like old beacons meant for someone who knew them well. Rowan left her at a modest roadside motel, making sure a room key reached her hand before disappearing back into the night. Inside the room, the heater clicked to life with a weary groan. Eliza placed her field notebook on the table, intending to record the odd sighting of the red coyote. Wildlife anomalies were not rare, but something about this one tightened her chest in a way she could not quantify. The memory of its unmoving stare followed her into the quiet space of the room. Hale Bridge itself felt different from other rural towns she had passed through. People she encountered briefly as she checked in had watched her with a careful attention that was neither unfriendly nor welcoming. Their expressions held a shared understanding of something unsaid, a subtle tension that shifted whenever the wind picked up. It reminded her of coastal towns that tracked storms by instinct alone. She drew the curtains and prepared to sleep, exhaustion dragging at her muscles. Yet just as her breathing began to settle, a sound broke the stillness outside the thin motel walls. It was low, resonant, threading through the branches and the drifting fog. At first it resembled a coyote's call, but the pitch carried a strange, human-like tremor beneath it, almost a mournful wail shaped into something more deliberate. The noise rose once, faded, then repeated from farther away, as though whatever made it moved with purpose through the forest beyond the town. Eliza lay awake, listening, unable to convince herself this was simply wildlife behavior. Something else traveled through those trees, something organized, something unseen. And somewhere between understanding and uncertainty, she realized the night had shifted around her, pulling her quietly into a place where the rules she trusted no longer applied. Morning arrived without ceremony, slipping over Hale Bridge like a thin veil rather than a true dawn. The motel windows framed a town that appeared functional at first glance. Cars moved along the main road with mechanical predictability. A small auto parts shop raised its shutters with a metallic groan. Steam drifted from a single corner cafe, marking the place where locals instinctively gathered. Yet beneath these familiar signs of life lay a tension that felt older than the town itself. Eliza stepped into the cool air and immediately sensed how still it was. Even the wind seemed to move more cautiously here, brushing against her jacket as though testing boundaries. The scent of pine and river mud carried an undercurrent of something metallic, faint but persistent. Hale Bridge looked alive, but the rhythm beating beneath its surface belonged to a different pulse entirely. Inside the cafe, she became the subject of discreet glances, not the curious kind travelers typically earned, but the sort that measured threat, timing, intent. The patrons spoke in subdued tones, their shoulders angled not toward each other but toward the windows, as if keeping track of the forest at the town's edge. The bell above the door chimed now and then, but no one's expression changed. They behaved like people accustomed to scanning their surroundings without appearing to. A man in his 50s eventually slid into the seat across from her. His hands bore the thick scarring of someone who had dragged bodies through fire and debris. He talked about Hale Bridge with the detached tenderness of someone who both loved and feared it. He mentioned an old clan of hunters, generations deep, once charged with safeguarding the forests. According to him, the line had thinned over the years as residents disappeared in the woods. Officials blamed predators, exposure, misadventure. But the stories in town suggested something else. The vanished had not been found torn apart. They had simply never returned, as if escorted away by an unseen hand. When he left, Eliza remained at the table, absorbing every detail. Her fieldwork had sharpened her sense for patterns. Newspaper clippings pinned on a bulletin board near the counter confirmed what the man implied. Missing person notices stretched back decades. No confirmed animal attacks. No forensic evidence. Despite the claims of coyotes and mountain lions, the data showed clean absences instead of scattered remains. Outside, the sidewalks felt emptier than they should at mid-morning. She walked toward the edge of town, watching the buildings shift from weathered commercial fronts to older residential homes. Many windows were shuttered even in daylight. Lawns were trimmed with obsessive neatness, as if the people inside needed outward order to offset something the forest challenged nightly. Rowan appeared again, not with overt purpose but with quiet inevitability. He stood near the road as though he had always been there, a figure woven seamlessly into the background. His expression stayed neutral, yet his gaze tracked her movements with an attention that suggested he expected her to cross a line she could not yet see. There was no hostility in him, only an alertness that settled on her skin like static before a coming storm. Eliza acknowledged him with a nod and moved on, heading toward the outskirts where the forest pressed closest to the town. Her job had trained her to collect environmental details even when she was not officially working. Scat trails, soil disturbances, shifts in bird calls. Yet here her observations felt incomplete. The forest around Hale Bridge held signs of movement, but not the typical kind. Paths bent in unnatural arcs. Claw markings appeared on trees at heights coyotes could not reach. The silence between bird calls stretched too long, as if the wildlife waited for cues from something other than daylight. A group of teenagers intercepted her near an abandoned trail access. They moved with the loose gait of youth, but their eyes broke the illusion. Light-colored irises, almost amber, flickered with something unplaceable. Fear glimmered in them, fear of nightfall, fear of the forest, fear of disappointing someone unseen. Yet beneath the fear clung an odd devotion, not directed at her but toward a presence she could not identify. The way they glanced beyond her shoulder made her turn instinctively, though nothing stood behind her except the shifting shadows of pines. As dusk approached, the temperature dropped sharply. The town contracted with the cold, doors closing earlier than necessary, lights switching off one by one. Hale Bridge behaved like a creature preparing for something it endured nightly, something unavoidable and habitually survived. Rowan found her again near the old bridge crossing the river. His arrival was quiet, almost soundless. His expression carried a restrained warning. The message was clear enough. People did not go into the forest after dark. His concern did not feel like the perfunctory caution of a local advising a newcomer. It carried a weight that hinted at rules shaped by consequences he had seen firsthand. Eliza considered turning back. Years of fieldwork had taught her respect for wilderness after sunset. Yet the strange coyote from the night before lingered in her thoughts, along with the cold intensity in Rowan's eyes. Logic suggested waiting until morning. Curiosity, sharpened by instinct, pushed her forward. She stepped past the first line of trees just as the sun slipped below the ridge. The forest swallowed the last light quickly, leaving only narrow streaks of fatting amber along the branches. The air thickened, heavy with moisture and the scent of decaying leaves. The deeper she walked, the more the silence grew and then broke. Movement flickered at the edge of her vision, too fast for human stride, too silent for ordinary wildlife. The shapes did not stumble or hesitate. They coordinated, as though answering silent commands. Soft footfalls passed over snow without leaving indentations. Shadows crossed her path in synchronized arcs, vanishing and reappearing between trees. These were not coyotes. They were not people either. Something in their speed, their precision, their collective awareness unsettled the boundary between categories she had always relied on. For a moment she stood in the dark, barely breathing, listening to the forest shift around her like a distant heartbeat. Hale Bridge had shown her its surface that morning, its quiet streets, its tired storefronts, its people pretending normalcy. But now she saw the truth beneath it. The town was alive only in the daylight hours it was permitted. At night, something else awakened in the woods, something that moved as a pack but did not belong to any species she had studied. And though she could not see their faces, she felt their attention settle on her, marking her presence, evaluating her purpose. Hale Bridge pretended to live. The forest surrounding it did not pretend anything at all. Consciousness returned to her in fragments, sound first, then smell, then a slow, unwelcome awareness of her own body. Wood creaked somewhere above, a measured, familiar noise that suggested age but not neglect. The faint crackle of a fire stitched through the silence, steady and contained. The air tasted of resin and ash, with an undertone of something colder that clung to the back of her throat, like the memory of night air dragged indoors. Eliza opened her eyes to a ceiling of dark, heavy beams crossed with shallow scars. For a dazed instant, she thought of storm damage, then realized the marks ran too regular, too deliberate, each groove aligned with another, as if some creature had once tested its claws there and been allowed to repeat the gesture many times. She lay on a narrow bed pushed against a wall paneled in knotty pine. A thick wool blanket scratched gently against her chin, dense and heavier than anything from a motel. The mattress beneath her was firm, the sort that remembered use but not indulgence. She pushed herself up on her elbows, and a lance of pain slid from the back of her skull down along one side of her neck, not sharp enough to incapacitate her, but precise enough to remind her she had fallen. Memory answered slowly. The motel room, the sound outside the window, the forest swallowing the last light of day, movement between the trees too coordinated to belong to animals she knew. A slope, an impression of empty space beneath her feet. Then nothing more, only the sensation of being watched by many eyes at once. She scanned the room. It was not large, but every object in it looked like it had been chosen rather than accumulated. A dresser with iron handles stood opposite the bed, its surface bare except for a folded gray t-shirt and a glass of water with condensation sliding down the side. A simple chair waited near the window, its seat worn smooth in two places where someone had rested hands more often than weight. The window itself framed the tree line, and beyond that, the muted outline of the ridge that held back the sky. The glass reflected the movement of shadows before she clearly saw the ones outside. Shapes passed between the trees, broad at the shoulders, low to the ground. Too large for coyotes, too fluid for bears. They appeared and vanished with unnerving silence, as if the forest accepted their presence as part of its own anatomy. When she swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet met cool, sanded floorboards. A faint groove ran across the plank nearest the bed, another near the door, a third by the window. They formed a rough triangle, shallow and evenly spaced, as if someone had once stalked this room in a pattern during long, sleepless nights. Muscles in her shoulders protested as she stood, but her balance held. She crossed the room, pausing at the window. The view confirmed what her instincts had already told her. This house sat on the boundary of the forest and the town, close enough to the trees that branches nearly brushed the outer wall in the wind, far enough from the rest of Hale Bridge that she could not see another house in either direction. Rowan's house, she thought, and the name fit the frame like a key in a lock. The man in the truck. The one who had appeared at the roadside exactly when her car died. The one who had watched her in town with the patient caution of someone accustomed to dangerous things. When she stepped into the hallway beyond the bedroom door, the smell of wood smoke grew stronger. The corridor was narrow, lined with more wooden beams cut by old scars. Some consisted of straight, parallel lines, others of half-moons, as if claws had snagged and slid. At intervals, heavy brackets jutted from the walls at shoulder height. They held nothing now, but they looked as if they had once supported chains or lanterns or something else that needed to be secured against violent motion. She followed the warm light to what served as a main room. There she saw the rest of the house's character. It was both practical shelter and something like a watch station. A long table occupied the center of the space, carved from a single plank of wood and reinforced by metal braces. The surface bore faint ring marks where mugs had stood for hours and sharper indentations where knives had met bone. On one wall hung maps of the surrounding wilderness. They overlapped in layers, newer sheets pinned over older topographies, roots drawn in ink that had darkened with time. Some lines traced established hiking trails. Others followed paths that did not appear on any published guide, arcs over ridges, loops throwing wide shadows around certain valleys, tight clusters marking places where movement had concentrated. A few roots were marked twice, once in human script, once with a shorthand she did not recognize, made of short lines and slashes that looked almost like the notations trackers carved into bark. Other shelves held books, field guides to Pacific Northwest mammals, monographs on predator-prey dynamics, thin volumes about indigenous ceremonies and shapeshifter legends, compiled by anthropologists who likely had never intended their work to be used as anything but academic reference. Between them sat small objects that looked like offerings or anchors. River stones drilled and threaded onto leather cords, animal teeth with their tips worn smooth by handling, feathers arranged according to a pattern she did not yet understand. She heard movement in the adjoining room before she saw him, the sound of a chair pushed back, the soft thud of boots on wood. When Rowan emerged from the doorway, he carried no obvious weapons, but his presence filled the space as completely as the firelight. He wore a dark sweater with the sleeves pushed up to his forearms, exposing a web of faint scars crossing his skin. None of them looked accidental. They formed patterns of parallel lines and crescents that echoed the marks on the beams. He told her, in the same even tone he had used on the roadside, that he had found her near an exposed ledge at the edge of the forest. According to his account, she had been lying unconscious among shattered branches, not far from where the slope became sheer rock. He said the fall could have ended differently. She listened, cataloging every word, each pause, the way he looked just past her shoulder whenever he mentioned the forest. He spoke of luck, of loose soil, of roots catching her, of the danger of unstable ground after thaw. His voice remained controlled throughout, but something in the muscles along his jaw hinted at strain. His explanation sounded tidy in a way that did not match her memory of the night. What she remembered, before the blankness, had not been ground giving way. It had been presence. The sense of many bodies moving around her, of motion coordinated at a level beyond mere instinct. If she had simply slipped, if gravity alone had taken her, she would have expected bruises in different places, split skin, maybe even broken bone. Her pain felt instead like the consequence of a halted fall, of forces applied with intent rather than chance. He offered her food, a gesture that would have seemed hospitable in any other setting. A plate appeared on the table with eggs, toast, and sliced apple, nothing elaborate, nothing performative. Yet even in this simple act, his movements betrayed him. He reached for objects with the economical precision of someone who disliked wasted effort. His body flowed around obstacles without conscious adjustment. He did not fumble, did not hesitate, did not allow a plate to rattle louder than necessary against the wood. These were not the habits of a man who spent most of his life indoors. She ate because hunger eventually overrode suspicion. The warmth of the food spread through her, calming the tension in her shoulders just enough to sharpen her thoughts again. When she asked what he had been doing in the forest at that hour, his answer came with the same careful distance. He referred to patrols and security, mentioned recent reports of illegal hunters and traps. According to him, he worked for a private security group that partnered with local authorities to keep the woods safe from people who considered the land expendable. On the surface, his story fit. The illegal camp she had discovered higher up lent his claim a layer of plausibility. And yet his eyes, when they met hers, did not carry the weary bureaucratic resignation she had seen in other contracted rangers. Instead, there was a measured alertness there, a watchfulness that seemed less concerned with trespassers and more with unseen borders. In daylight, his eyes showed their true color, gray at first glance, but threaded with green near the pupils, turning pale at the ring. When the firelight caught them at the right angle, a vertical sheen appeared across the iris, a flash of brightness that gave the impression of slit pupils even though the shape remained round. It lasted only a heartbeat each time, impossible to prove, but once she noticed, she could not unsee it. As the day unfolded, she began to notice the house's other secrets. On the back of the main door, heavy iron bolts slid into reinforced sockets, deeper and more numerous than any ordinary lock required. The window frames bore faint gouges, as if something large had once tested them from the outside. A line of weathered metal hooks ran along one wall, each capable of holding significant weight. Most were empty now, but marks in the wood beneath them suggested that ropes or harnesses had hung there often. In a corner, partially concealed by stacked firewood, she found a pair of boots larger than Rowan, with deep impressions in the leather and dried mud caked into the grooves of the soles. Nearby lay a folded tarp that smelled faintly of animal musk, old blood, and antiseptic. This house accommodated more than one person and more than one kind of life. When she asked how far they were from town, he replied with a simple measure of miles and minutes. Yet the distance felt greater than that. From the back porch, Hale Bridge appeared as a scattering of roofs through gaps in the trees, diminished and fragile, like a place that had grown used to being overlooked by something vaster. The forest pressed from the other side, dense and unblinking. The more time she spent inside Rowan's house, the clearer it became that it sat at the center of an unseen network. Radios sat on a shelf, their frequencies tuned to channels she did not recognize. On the maps, certain locations bore symbols instead of names. Circles with slashes, triangles pointing inward, small marks in ink that resembled claw prints. The routes traced between them formed a web that did not match roads, property lines, or park boundaries. She began to understand that what she had glimpsed in the forest the night before was not a random gathering of animals or a trick of the dark. It had been a formation, a patrol of sorts, something that moved with purpose and obeyed an order she had not yet decoded. At some point during the afternoon, a low sound rolled through the air, so deep she felt it more in her bones than in her ears. It came from the direction of the forest, a muted vibration rather than a clear call. Rowan froze mid-step when it reached the house, his posture sharpening, his head tilting fractionally as if he were aligning himself to a frequency. The sound faded almost immediately, leaving the silence heavier than before. He resumed moving as though nothing had happened, but his gestures grew even more precise, as if an invisible clock had started counting down somewhere beyond the walls. Later, when the light thinned and the shadows stretched longer across the floor, he spoke of rules. He did not frame them as laws, did not name them as such, but the weight of them lay in the space between his words. Outsiders, he suggested, did not go into the forest after dark. Outsiders did not wander past certain points, ignored on public maps but very real on his. Outsiders did not linger in Hale Bridge without reason, and certainly did not ask too many questions about old disappearances or current patrols. He told her, with a calm that felt learned rather than natural, that the town followed a pattern for a reason. People closed their doors at certain hours, avoided certain trails, kept their animals indoors even when the weather tempted them outside. It was not superstition, he implied. It was adaptation. Behind the plain language, she heard something else, an unspoken code with sharper edges. Someone had drawn lines across this land long before park boundaries existed. Those who lived here had agreed, willingly or otherwise, to abide by those lines. The forest did not forgive those who ignored them. The town survived because it remembered. She recognized the structure even without the details. As a scientist, she had worked with unspoken norms all her career, political lines you did not cross, inconvenient data you did not emphasize in public. Here the stakes were not reputation but survival. The same architecture of fear had been built into a different shape. The law she sensed beneath his explanations was not written anywhere in this house, yet it hung in the air with the same certainty as the smell of smoke. No outsider learned too much. No outsider saw what moved between the trees without paying for the knowledge. No outsider walked both in the town and at the forest's edge without choosing a side. She realized with a cold clarity that settled in her chest that her presence in Rowan's home meant someone had already bent that law. He had brought her here, sheltered her, allowed her to see the maps on his wall, the scars on his beams, the way the shadows outside moved in patterns. Whether he had done it out of necessity, obligation, or something less easy to name, the result was the same. A rule had been nudged out of alignment. As evening drew close, the house changed subtly. Rowan checked the bolts on the doors one by one, his fingers lingering for a heartbeat on each metal piece before moving on. He adjusted the fire, not adding more wood but banking it so the flames burned lower, shedding less light that could leak through slits in the curtains. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone preparing not for guests, but for an expected siege. Eliza stood by the window again, watching as the last light drained from the sky. The tree line darkened into a single mass, more like a solid wall than a collection of individual trunks and branches. Somewhere beyond it, something that had paced her on the previous night now stirred again, following a rhythm completely independent of clock time. The house felt like a fulcrum, balancing between two worlds. In one, she was a contracted biologist whose car had broken down in the wrong place at the wrong moment. In the other, she was an anomaly in a system that preferred neat boundaries. Human or not, inside or outside, ignorant or initiated. She understood that the town's greatest law was not about hunting permits or property rights. It was about secrecy. Whatever lived in these woods, whatever shared their space with Hale Bridge, had survived this long because it remained unseen and unnamed by most of the world. That secrecy was enforced with more than social pressure. It was guarded the way wild animals guarded dens and territories, with watchfulness, and when necessary, with violence. By the time full dark settled over the ridge, Eliza accepted a quiet, unadorned fact. She had already crossed the boundary this unnamed law existed to protect. She had walked into the forest after sunset followed movements that did not belong to any species in her notebooks, and woken in the house of a man whose eyes reflected light the way a predator's did. The law she could not yet articulate had already been broken on her behalf. The question that remained, settling around her like the night itself, was simple and terrifying. Would this hidden world decide to correct that breach by shutting her out, or by never letting her leave again? Eliza spent most of the morning tracing the markings on Rowan's maps until the ink felt burned into her vision. The symbols she had once dismissed as idiosyncrasies now formed a pattern strong enough to override every rational objection she tried to raise. Each disappearance in Hale Bridge's archives matched a migration path marked by slashes, crescents, and spirals. The paths shifted with the seasons, but the correlation remained constant across decades. Whatever moved along those routes did so deliberately, as if following an internal map older than the town itself. She checked the dates again, comparing dry months to wet ones, winters of heavy snow to lean winters when predators roamed farther. The overlay was too exact to be coincidence. People vanished in the same windows of time when the marked routes thickened with additional symbols, as though someone had anticipated heightened movement. The symbols did not indicate danger zones, but traffic, the travel of something organized enough to be tracked by generations of watchers. The longer she studied them, the more the routes resembled arteries converging around a hidden heart. By mid-afternoon, she could no longer sit in the house while those lines burned behind her eyes. She layered on her jacket and stepped outside, following the northernmost route on the map. It wound through thinning pines and past a ridge that overlooked the skeleton of an old fire road. The air felt colder there, less like typical Pacific Northwest humidity, and more like the lingering breath of something that had passed recently. 3 miles in, the forest changed. The silence grew intentional rather than natural. Birds vanished. The underbrush thinned. Paths that should have forked simply continued forward, as if shaped by years of identical footfalls. Every sense she had sharpened in her fieldwork told her she had crossed an invisible border. She noticed them only when they wanted her to. At first, they appeared as scattered figures between the trees, teenagers or close enough to pass for them, but their posture betrayed something older. Their bodies were wiry, coiled with a strength that did not come from sports or work. Their eyes reflected light even in shade, capturing it and throwing it back in an amber glow that hinted at a predator's lens. They encircled her without raising a hand or voice. Their breath came too quietly. Their weight barely disturbed the ground. They did not threaten her. They confined her gently but decisively, forming an instinctive perimeter between her and whatever lay ahead. She sensed coordination beneath their stillness, as if each waited for a signal she could not detect. They behaved less like individuals and more like extensions of a single organism guarding its boundary. A pressure built in the air, as if the forest itself held its breath. When the pack revealed itself, it did so not through dramatic transformation, but subtle rearrangement. Shadows deepened behind the teenagers, shifting as if the trees themselves bent. Eliza blinked, unsure whether light simply played tricks on her tired mind. But the shapes in the edges of her vision took form, bodies moving faster than her eyes could track, their outlines flickering between human proportions and something that dragged low to the ground, elongated by speed. Muscles slid under skin in ways that defied anatomy textbooks. Limbs extended into arcs before compressing again. Their movement lacked the chaos of a wild animal rush. It carried the precision of a coordinated patrol. The forest accepted them without protest. They belonged to it in a way she could only observe, never mimic. Only when the ground beneath her seemed to tense, as though bracing for impact, did Rowan appear. His arrival did not break the silence. It altered its gravity. One moment the perimeter held, the next it parted, shifting around him with the instinctive deference of a flock encountering its true north. He stepped into the clearing with a steadiness that required no display. His presence alone commanded the pack's focus. Eliza saw at once that this was not the version of Rowan she had met on the road. Something older lived beneath his skin here, something that recognized her presence as both anomaly and threat. The lines carved across his forearms and collarbone caught the forest light in a way that made them seem less like scars and more like inscriptions. His eyes held the same strange gleam she had seen before, but here, in the territory of his choosing, the gleam was unmasked. Beneath their human structure lay something sharp, luminous, almost vertical. The pack loosened its formation, but did not retreat. It watched him, waiting. He regarded Eliza with a layered expression she could not parse. There was no anger in it, yet no relief either. He looked at her as one might regard a door unexpectedly left open between two worlds that should never touch. His attention swept the perimeter, confirming the pack's posture, then returned to her, heavy with calculation. Only then did she understand why the routes on the maps resembled migration patterns. These were not animals wandering aimlessly. They were people, if that word could still apply, living in two states at once. Their bodies existed in flux, shifting between human shape and something that moved closer to shadow than flesh. They had adapted to darkness, speed, and terrain with a precision no natural species possessed. The teenagers around her were the younger among them. Those whose shapes bent more drastically were the seasoned ones, and Rowan stood at their center, the axis around which the entire system rotated. He kept the explanation brief, revealing only enough to keep her alive. She learned that the pack once lived openly among isolated communities in the far north, where transformation was not myth but heritage. Over time, stories spread, and stories drew hunters. Government teams attempted to capture them under the guise of wildlife research, believing their shifting state could be weaponized or cataloged. When negotiations failed, the pursuit turned violent. Many of the pack died during what survivors called the last hunt. Others fled south, scattering across forests that offered more cover and fewer questions. Hale Bridge became one of their refuges, chosen for its remoteness and its capacity for silence. The disappearances Eliza had studied with scientific detachment were not random. Some were casualties of conflict, intruders who stumbled into transformation cycles or witnessed what no outsider was meant to see. Others were those who came with intent: poachers, hunters, men who followed the scent of rumors and ended up swallowed by the woods. The pack did not kill recklessly. It enforced a boundary necessary for its survival. Eliza saw, with mounting clarity, that she had pressed against that boundary until it bent. Rowan had pulled her into his house not out of hospitality, but prevention. She had witnessed a transitional form the night she fell. Leaving her in the forest would have meant either her death or her transformation into a liability too great to ignore. Saving her had violated a rule as old as their exile. Her continued presence created risk not only for her, but for them. If she left Hale Bridge with knowledge intact, the cycle that once destroyed their northern kin could repeat. She felt the truth settle into her like cold water. Every person who had disappeared over the decades had brushed against this secret in one way or another. Not all had been malicious. Some had simply asked the wrong questions or walked the wrong trail at dusk. But intent mattered less than exposure. A single witness could unravel them. The pack watched her with the unblinking patience of creatures accustomed to choosing between concealment and survival. Rowan alone stood between her and whatever outcome the pack considered necessary. His authority held them in place, but she sensed it could use up its margin quickly. For the first time, she understood why his house sat on the border between forest and town. He lived as a hinge between two worlds, holding one back from consuming the other. As the pack dissolved back into the trees and the teenagers scattered with unnatural speed, Rowan remained. The forest exhaled, releasing a small tremor of stillness that felt almost like relief. He studied her with an expression stripped of its earlier restraint. It held caution, weariness, and something like resignation, not toward her, but toward the inevitability of what came next. Eliza realized the truth had a cost, and she had already begun paying it simply by standing here. The forest closed behind them like the gate of an old kingdom, guarding a secret that had survived only because those who learned it rarely lived long enough to speak. The storm announced itself long before the first snowflake touched the ground. The barometric pressure slid downwards in a slow, oppressive curve that Eliza felt as a weight behind her eyes. The air over Hale Bridge thickened, turning metallic and restless. Locals glanced more often at the sky, at the line of trees, at the road that cut through the valley like a wound. They arrived the day before the weather was expected to break. 3 dark SUVs rolled into town in a tight formation, engines humming with controlled power. Their paint carried no logos, no park insignias, no company decals. The absence was more telling than any badge. The vehicles stopped with practiced synchronicity in front of the town hall and the old fire station, as if they had studied the map long before the tires touched asphalt. Men and women stepped out in matching jackets, standard-issue boots, and the relaxed, predatory posture of people who trusted both their training and their weapons. Their haircuts were regulation neat or deliberately indistinct, their expressions professionally neutral. To a casual observer, they could have been federal wildlife officers, surveyors, or disaster assessment teams. Eliza knew, better the moment she saw their equipment. She watched from the corner table of the coffee shop across the street, pretending to focus on her laptop. They unloaded sleek black cases with reinforced edges, each one labeled in a code that meant nothing to townsfolk, but too much to anyone familiar with field tech. One case bore the slim antennae of a portable array. Another housed a stack of cylindrical devices that looked too refined to be mundane sensors. Coil-like assemblies disappeared into a third case, and she recognized the basic shape of directional emitters. Later, when they brought out long, narrow boxes with discrete hazard stickers and carried them with the careful, unspoken reverence reserved for weapons or explosives, she stopped pretending there was any ambiguity. The memory of Rowan's brief explanation about the last hunt pressed against her thoughts like a bruise. Government teams had tried once before to capture and weaponize what his people were. The survivors had fled, scattered, learned to live as ghosts. Now the ghosts were being hunted again. Officially, the newcomers identified themselves as federal researchers conducting a predator impact assessment ahead of a proposed expansion in protected lands. The sheriff shook their hands on the town hall steps. Local officials nodded in the way of people who knew they had no leverage. Flyers appeared on notice boards within an hour, warning residents to stay out of designated forest sectors for the duration of a wildlife survey. Eliza examined one in the coffee shop, tracing the boundaries with a fingertip. The closure area matched, almost perfectly, the densest part of Rowan's migration routes. The hunters either understood the pack's movement intimately or had access to data compiled by minds as obsessive as her own. In the late afternoon, she drifted near the open bay of the fire station under the pretense of asking about the storm. No one stopped her from seeing what lay inside. Two of the black cases stood open on a folding table. Inside nested compact devices with vents and fins, each with a mesh grill at one end and a cluster of cables at the other. They were small enough to be staked into snowbanks or lashed to trees. The units were labeled with acronyms she recognized from obscure studies on non-lethal area denial and animal control. They were not meant for deer or bears. Ultrasonic emitters could be tuned to frequencies that agitated, confused, or drove away wildlife. Paired with scent markers and chemical tags, they could herd animals along pre-selected corridors like cattle through a chute. Against beings whose senses extended beyond human parameters, such tools became something more dangerous, a net cast over an invisible population. Eliza assembled the picture quickly and with growing dread. The plan was not simple extermination. The hunters intended to push the pack, Rowan's people, into predetermined kill zones, then observe, isolate, and, if possible, capture. Bloodshed was not an unfortunate side effect, but built into the structure of the operation. News of the impending storm threaded through the town like rumor. Locals spoke of downed power lines and closed roads. The hunters spoke quietly among themselves, checking barometric readings and recalibrating timeframes. A storm meant complications for communications and extraction, but it also meant tracks would vanish quickly. No one outside the valley would see what happened here. Back at Rowan's house, the woods felt tight and listening. The wind funneled through the trees with rising urgency, warning of what approached. Snow had not begun to fall yet, but the clouds massing above the ridge carried the heavy promise of it. Rowan listened to her summary in silence. His face remained calm, but his shoulders took on the contained tension of someone bracing for impact. He already knew, she realized. Not the specifics, perhaps, but the pattern. Groups like this moved the same way, whether they called themselves coalition task forces, research divisions, or special operations teams. He gathered his people as the light drained from the sky. Eliza watched the pack assemble on the slopes above the house, shapes separating from tree trunks and rocks as though the forest itself had grown eyes and limbs. Some came in human form, others in that fluid state between densities, their edges hazy, as if night had begun to claim them. The plan that emerged was as much instinct as strategy. Rowan intended to lead the pack deeper into the forest and higher into terrain the hunters' vehicles could not reach. The storm would make air support difficult. Steep, broken ground would limit heavy equipment. The goal was not to engage, but to outlast, to let the weather do what it had always done best in these mountains. Erase, obscure, protect. Eliza understood the logic even as unease gnawed at her. Hunters with this level of preparation rarely relied on a single tactic. They would anticipate flight into rough terrain. There would be contingencies, secondary teams, aerial drones, remote-triggered traps. The ultrasound emitters and chemical markers suggested a plan to manipulate movement rather than merely predict it. As dusk thickened, the first devices lit up in the forest. She detected them before she saw them. A pressure built behind her ears, an almost inaudible ringing that did not match the wind's pitch. Animals reacted more visibly. Birds erupted from trees in frantic bursts. A stray dog in town flattened itself against the ground and whimpered without obvious cause. Somewhere farther up the slope, a herd of deer broke rhythm and scattered, their orderly tracks dissolving into panicked crisscrosses. When she finally found one of the units staked into the snow at the edge of a drainage, it pulsed with a faint, intermittent glow. The grill at its face vibrated with a frequency too high for human hearing, but perceptible to nerve endings. Beside it, markers embedded in the snow released chemicals that were odorless to her, but pungent to noses tuned like the pack. Together, they formed a line of influence, pushing sensitive creatures away from some routes and nudging them toward others. Grid by grid, the hunters were riding invisible rails across the landscape. Rowan's decision to move the pack inward collided with this reality like opposing currents meeting in a narrow channel. The paths he knew as safe were being altered in real time. Where he expected cover, the pack would encounter corridors of agitation. Where he saw open escape routes, the hunters were building funnels. The first collision came just after nightfall. Snow began as a fine, hesitant dusting, quickly thickening into dense flakes driven nearly horizontal by the wind funneling between ridges. The forest turned monochrome and depthless. Visibility shrank. Eliza moved with Rowan along one of his known routes, flanked at a distance by members of the pack. Their forms blurred and sharpened as they shifted density to adapt to rock, snow, and shadow. Ahead, a line of light snapped on low to the ground. A string of emitters, placed with cruel efficiency, flickered to life in sequence. The air between trunks thrummed. The pack members nearest the line stiffened, their bones and muscles reacting to a frequency that scraped along their nerves. The storm swallowed sound, but the effect moved through the group like a flinch. Rowan altered course immediately, guiding them upslope toward a steeper, rockier face. For a brief, fragile moment, it seemed the adjustment might be enough. Then a flare of orange burst in the distance, followed by the stuttered promotion of radio chatter faintly audible on the wind. The hunters had anticipated this deviation. Secondary units activated above, trailing new lines of ultrasonic pressure across the slope. The valley became a maze, in which only one side possessed the full map. Eliza's mind worked furiously. She recognized the pattern from wildlife management plans designed to steer herds away from highways or into capture pens. Replace deer with shapeshifters and the principles remained the same. Sound barriers here, scent attractants there, pressure from behind to keep the group moving. The storm limited visibility, but technology made up for it. Thermal scopes and motion sensors would track bodies even through snow. The first gunshot shattered the storm's muffled rhythm like a dropped pane of glass. It came from the direction of the lower drainage, a flat, controlled crack that belonged to a marksman, not a panicked shooter. Another followed. Voices rose, not as words she could parse, but as sharp bursts of command. The pack reacted as one organism jerked by a wire. Some tilted toward flight, others toward confrontation. Rowan held them in a tenuous center, his authority a gravitational pull. Despite his efforts, the lines tightened. By the time they reached the edge of a shallow basin, the hunters had begun to constrict around the pack's position. Flashing indicators on staked devices encircled the low ground. The ultrasound hammered harder, an invisible drumbeat on bone and nerve. Snow churned under the pack's feet as they moved, their usual fluidity disrupted by pulses of discomfort. Eliza saw, in quick, disjointed flashes, how easily this basin could become a slaughter pen. The emitters would drive the pack inward, consolidating them. Then tranquilizers and bullets would rain from the ridgeline under the cover of the storm. Bodies would fall in the snow, and wind would erase footsteps long before any outside investigation could arrive. The first blood spilled at the edge of the basin. A young shifter, one of the teenagers Eliza had seen watching her in town, lunged toward what he believed was a gap in the hunter's formation. A shot tracked his movement, finding flesh with terrible accuracy. His body folded mid-stride, momentum carrying him into a drift where his form flickered and partially destabilized under pain. Dark color bled into white, stark and immediate. The sight tore something open in the pack. A ripple of contained fury broke and surged toward the source of the shot. The hunters, anticipating that response, tightened their positions, forming interlocking fields of fire. The basin's air filled with the dull thuds of impact, the sharp hiss of projectiles cutting through snowfall, the muffled sounds of bodies hitting snow. Rowan moved like the center of a storm fighting not to form. His shifting was no longer subtle. His muscles surged beneath his skin in waves that altered the proportions of his frame. At points his forearms seemed denser, darker, as if stone had grown under the flesh. His stride turned into a series of explosive drives that carried him between bursts of gunfire in arcs too abrupt to be humanly possible. Eliza glimpsed him as he closed on one of the flanks, his body half shadow, half man. He hit a hunter with the force of an avalanche, sending the man sprawling into the snow. Another turned his weapon toward Rowan and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck his side, sparks rippling across his skin where it had thickened under instinctive armor. The round bruised but did not penetrate fully. His hand, no longer entirely human in shape, lashed out and wrenched the weapon aside. At the basin's far end, a more focused pocket of conflict formed. The leader of the hunting unit had taken position on a small prominence, using altitude and portable sensors to coordinate fire. Even through the storm, Eliza recognized something unsettlingly familiar in his stance. The confidence of a man who had faced these beings before and survived. The scars along his jaw and neck glowed faintly under the green wash of his night optics, a map of old encounters. Rowan angled toward him through the chaos, propelled by a history Eliza only partially understood. The storm wrapped them both in a curtain of moving white, turning their confrontation into shadow against shadow. Shots flashed. Forms collided. For brief moments, one body seemed to disappear into the other, as shifts in density blurred impact. Rowan drove the man back along the ridge, each movement a study in controlled ferocity. Around them, younger pack members tried to hold lines, to keep the hunters from encircling fully. A few fell, their bodies collapsing in hard, abrupt arcs that ended in craters of blood-mottled snow. Others managed to disarm or disable opponents, using speed and angle rather than brute strength. The storm made everything slower for the humans and sharper for those adapted to the dark. Despite their advantages, the pack could not sustain a fight like this indefinitely. The hunters had brought more than firearms and ultrasound. When one of the black cases opened near the tree line, Eliza saw the glint of heavier ordnance. Shaped charges, perhaps, or canisters designed to disperse something into the air. Alongside them, comms gear hummed with a faint, insistent persistence, its antennae cutting clean lines against the snow-blurred sky. That, more than the guns, crystallized her decision. If the hunters maintained contact with their command structure, reinforcements would come as soon as the storm eased enough to allow air travel or cleared roads. The pack might survive tonight only to face something worse tomorrow. Drones, more units, a quarantine of the entire valley under a fabricated pretext. The only way to break the cycle was to sever its communication spine. Her knowledge of human systems became leverage. She slipped along the edge of the basin, using the chaos and limited visibility as cover. While attention fixed on moving bodies and returns on thermal scopes, she became one more cold outline in a forest full of them. Her training as a field biologist had taught her how to move without triggering wildlife. Now she applied it to avoiding human focus. The main communications hub sat slightly upslope, sheltered by a stand of firs. A portable mast rose from the center of a cluster of gear, anchored by guy lines that vanished into snow. Cables snaked from the mast into hardened cases, feeding power and data into compact repeaters. Small indicator lights flickered on their panels, signaling active links. A generator chugged nearby, its sound smothered by the storm. She approached from the blind side, the one angle least accessible to ballistic trajectories from the basin. No one guarded it directly. The hunters had grown accustomed to believing the threat came only from one direction. They had planned for claws and teeth, not for someone who understood the language of their hardware. Her hands moved quickly, driven by both adrenaline and memory. Years of handling sensitive equipment under harsh conditions had left their imprint in muscle and nerve. She knew the weak points of field setups, vulnerable cables, essential connections, cooling vents that could be blocked, power sources that could be compromised. A multi-tool from her pocket made short work of the first cable. She severed it cleanly, feeling the tension give under the blade. Indicator lights blinked in confusion, then died on one of the cases as its data feed disappeared. She pulled another connector free with more force than finesse, yanking out a bundle in a shower of sparks. The generator's tone shifted as its load changed abruptly. A sudden burst of static rippled through the airwaves, manifesting as a brief stutter in the hunter's radios. Voices spiked in alarm, abruptly losing clarity. Commands became fragments. The coordination that had made their movements so efficient began to fray. She could have stopped there. Disabling part of the system would already complicate their operation. But the image of the young shifter collapsing into the snow, the sight of Rowan taking bullets meant to anchor him in one form and pin him down, burned away any hesitation. She grabbed one of the heavier cases and flipped it off the table. It tumbled into a drift and cracked open, internals splintering against hidden rock. Another she jammed with snow, forcing handfuls into vents and ports until freezing wetness seeped into circuits. The generator was last. She tore at its fuel line with numb fingers until it tore free, the warm chemical scent of gasoline bursting into the cold air. She backed away and hurled a rock into the housing. Metal rang. Something inside snapped. The engine coughed and stalled. Silence rushed into the space left by the machine's shutdown, filled only by wind and distant shouts. Above, the antenna sagged slightly as failed systems stopped compensating for gusts. Somewhere in the valley, a remote connection died without warning, leaving a command center staring at flat lines where live feeds had been. On the ridge, the hunter leader faltered, glancing toward the mast as his earpiece cut out. That fraction of attention lost was enough. Rowan's next movement drove the man back hard, forcing him to choose between a fall and a retreat. He chose survival, rolling downslope to regroup, his advantage eroding with every second of disarray. Eliza knew what she had done in human terms. She had destroyed federal property, sabotaged an operation, and, in the language of the agencies that fielded these teams, compromised mission integrity. Any claim she might have had to neutrality or professional distance vanished the instant the cables snapped in her hands. Snow plastered her hair and eyelashes as she stood in the wreckage of the comms cluster. Her breath came fast, steaming in the cold. Below, the battle shifted, no longer controlled by a single distant mind, but by individuals forced to make decisions in confusion. For the pack, that chaos meant fewer synchronized kill shots and more narrow escapes. For her, it meant a clean cut with the world that had taught her to measure predators only in terms of population and impact. In the falling snow, surrounded by broken plastic and dead indicator lights, Eliza understood fully that she had crossed a line it was impossible to uncross. She no longer lived solely in the world of people who filled out reports and debated ethics in conference rooms. With one deliberate act, she had placed herself beside those who ran through forests between densities, hunted for what they were rather than what they did. The storm swallowed the last flicker of light from the fallen equipment. In its place rose the harsh, living sounds of a fight that was no longer one-sided. The storm passed with the quiet finality of something that had exhausted all its violence. Dawn revealed a forest scraped raw by wind and pursuit, its branches bowed, its drifts torn by the traces of conflict. The clearing where the hunters had made their stand lay half-buried already, as if the snow itself was eager to erase every footprint, every broken branch, every dark stain that did not belong to winter. The pack had disappeared into the deeper territory before sunrise. Those still strong enough to travel shifted into lighter forms and vanished among the trees with practiced silence. The wounded moved more slowly, supported by others who guided them toward hidden shelters, burrows of stone and old roots where heat collected and sound did not travel. No one lingered near the battlefield. This was the rhythm of those who had survived centuries of pursuit. Strike, move, vanish, heal, endure. In their wake, only an emptiness remained, an absence that pressed against the air like the fatting echo of a howl. The town of Hale Bridge, standing at the edge of this uneasy wilderness, drifted into an unnatural stillness. Windows remained shuttered longer than usual. Residents stepped outside only to sweep snow from porches before retreating again, as though unwilling to acknowledge the shape of the night that had passed. The few who did cross paths avoided meeting one another's eyes, carrying the tacit understanding that something had shifted beneath the thin crust of normalcy the town had always worn. A tension ran through the streets, like a fault line, waiting for movement. Eliza returned to Rowan's house with the knowledge that she could no longer pretend to belong to the world she had arrived from. The hunters' operation, her sabotage, the blood that soaked into the snow, all of it formed a boundary she could never step back across. She opened the door with a sense of both trespass and inevitability, recognizing that the house had become a point of no return. Inside, Rowan lay where the pack had carried him after the fighting. The wounds along his side pulsed with slow, deliberate regeneration, but the process was uneven, as though the storm and the battle had taxed reserves even his body was not used to spending. The half-stone density that had shielded him earlier had faded, leaving traces of bruised flesh where bullets had struck and failed to penetrate. His breathing was steady, but shallow, the kind that belonged to someone who had forced himself beyond the limits of instinct. Eliza cared for him with the mixture of precision and intuition that had always guided her work. She cleaned blood from his skin, replaced soaked bandages, and monitored the subtle fluctuations of his temperature and pulse. The house was dim, lit only by the muted glow of oil lamps and the pale grayness seeping through the windows. Each sound, the crackling of the stove, the shift of Rowan's weight, the distant groan of settling beams, seemed amplified by the fragile quiet. Caring for him in this space felt like tending a flame that could either strengthen or die, depending on the slightest misjudgment. Something changed in the long hours she spent at his side. It was not spoken, not acknowledged with words, but existed as a steady current between them. He allowed her to remain close, to touch him without the guarded stillness he usually carried. She sensed that her presence grounded him more than the bandages or salves ever could. He, in return, gave her a place where she did not have to perform competence or distance. Their silence held a gravity that shaped the room more completely than any conversation. While he rested, Rowan told her what he had withheld before. The pack had once been driven into service under the guise of research, shift studies, sensory mapping, controlled stress trials. The experiments escalated until they aimed to mold a new kind of soldier, one who existed in both physical and shadow states. His father had led the escape after years of captivity, sacrificing his own life to buy the others' time. The survivors scattered across regions until the hunters began to track their signatures again, forcing them to construct towns like Hale Bridge to disguise their presence. Eliza listened with growing clarity. The town had never been merely a settlement. It was a living camouflage, a carefully maintained facade shielding a people who had learned to hide their history in the spaces between mundane routines. Every quiet street, every shuttered business, every resident who avoided strangers played a part in preserving the fragile boundary between the seen and the unseen. When reports crackled across abandoned channels that the hunters were requesting a second wave of reinforcements, the threat sharpened into urgency. Eliza recognized the pattern from her years analyzing human systems. A failed first engagement rarely deterred agencies that measured outcomes in percentages rather than lives. The next attempt would be larger, more indiscriminate, and far more difficult to evade. It was she who proposed the solution, drawing from the hunters' own coded transmissions and the fragments of protocol she had overheard. If the incoming team believed the primary target had been neutralized, they would suspend the second wave deployment long enough for the pack to disperse. A single message, properly structured and signed with the correct cryptographic sequence, could create the illusion of mission completion. In a system built on hierarchical trust, that illusion would hold just long enough. The idea carried a risk she did not voice. Sending such a message meant directly falsifying federal data, an act that crossed into treason on paper even if it protected those who had no legal status to defend themselves. Rowan weighed the cost in silence before giving his assent. Together, they constructed the brief message, calibrated its signature, and transmitted it into the storm-muted frequencies. The false confirmation disappeared into the ether, indistinguishable from the authentic reports it imitated. By morning, the valley felt different. The storm's remnants drifted lazily across roofs and trees, but beneath the calm lay a deeper transformation. The house that had seemed isolated now existed on a line dividing two realities. One world documented, categorized, and hunted anomalies. The other existed through adaptation, secrecy, and the ability to move through darkness as easily as through air. Eliza had stepped into the space between them and found herself unwilling to step back. Rowan joined her at the doorway, standing with the careful stiffness of someone healing but not yet whole. The forest beyond the porch looked unchanged, quiet, pristine, almost indifferent, but she knew the stillness masked motion and watching eyes. Rowan regarded the valley with an expression shaped by both responsibility and fatigue. The house, the town, the hidden shelters, everything rested on the fragile promise of temporary safety. He acknowledged that Hale Bridge would forever sit on a boundary between hunters and hunted, between the history they carried and the future they fought to build. He regarded Eliza with a steadiness that spoke of decisions made during the darkest hours of the night. She understood what he meant without needing him to form the words. The pack had survived because of her, and survival had created a bond that was not easily severed. She chose to remain not because she lacked alternatives, but because for the first time her knowledge, her instinct to analyze and protect, had become something essential rather than merely useful. She had crossed the border between observer and participant and found belonging in the act. That night, as the pack gathered deep within the forest, their voices rose in a low, resonant chorus that vibrated through the trees like a subterranean current. The sound was neither entirely wolf nor entirely human, but something ancient that predated both. Eliza stood with Rowan on the threshold of the house, listening as the song threaded through the darkness, acknowledging her as part of the world it guarded. In that moment, she understood that she no longer straddled two lives, but carried both within her, and that this tension, this meeting of fracture lines, was what made her alive in a way she had never been before. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.